Thank you all for being here. This meeting is going to be recorded, and this is going to be the second webinar in a 4-part series about conservation in North Carolina, titled How Your Land Matters in Conservation. We've got a lot of really great things available for you today. As you might have noticed, this meeting will be recorded and later posted on the Forest Her NC website. So for anybody who doesn't catch the webinar today, you can watch it later. My name is Fallon Owens, by the way. I will be your moderator today. And again, this is our second in a 4-part series. We already did one in April called the Conversation on Conservation to introduce the topic of conservation. Today will be how your land plays a role in the larger picture of conservation, some of the challenges we face in conservation in North Carolina, and how you can help to create healthy people, healthy water, healthy land, and healthy wildlife by participating in some of our recommendations. Later on, we will have 2 more webinars, one in September and one in December, that will focus a little bit more on the nitty-gritty details and tools on how to actually engage in conservation on your property. So look forward to those, and please save those dates. Now I'm going to give it over to Bob Barden, who's going to talk a little bit about housekeeping for our Zoom meeting today.
Thanks, Fallon. As you see here on the slide, today we will take questions through the chat box, or if you're having technical issues, you can also enter that into the chat box. We will address questions as speakers get done. And then at the end of the session, if you got other additional questions, we'll take them at that time too. Nobody requested closed captioning, but if you do want closed captioning, you can click on live transcript and we can turn that on for you. And if you would like to ask your question via audio, you can raise your hand and we'll call on you for that.
All right. Thank you, Bob, our Zoom webinar guru. So today's agenda, we've got a lot of really, really great information to present to you guys. A total of 5 speakers from multiple different organizations in North Carolina. We're going to start out with Casey Cook, who is with the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission. And she's going to talk a little bit about the challenges in conservation that we face in the state. After Casey talks, there's going to be a very short period for Q&A just with her about her presentation. And then we're going to go into a series of talks about all the different ways that your land plays a role. We've got 4 different presenters, and after they all present, then we're going to open it up for a general Q&A so we can all kind of chat about what we've learned. So look forward to that. And I think I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen and hand it over to Casey Cook to talk about the challenges of conservation.
All right, I'm just going to get set up here real quick. Thank you all for your interest in this webinar today and this topic. So I'm with the Wildlife Commission, so my talk's going to have a wildlife kind of focus. Across the landscape, our main conservation challenge is habitat fragmentation, which leads to habitat loss for wildlife and plants. It is also challenging for landowners because it increases the number of neighbors you have and increases property taxes around you, which complicates owning land. So before I briefly explain habitat fragmentation, this may help set the scene. Forests are 61% of the state's total land area. Only about 3% of forest land is not in commercial timber production of some sort. 83% of forest land is private and 56% is family or individual owned. And you can see there's kind of that pattern of fragmentation in that private forest land especially. So here's a closer look at the conservation challenges of habitat fragmentation. In terms of wildlife, forest habitat is easily fragmented by development, which is a huge reason why private forest land is so important. So here you can see how The patches of forest, are pretty limited and they're getting fragmented. They are fragmented in this urban landscape or suburban landscape. So habitat fragmentation causes edge effects. So more predators live in the forest edge and plant growth can be overwhelmingly thick, actually reducing the amount of forest food of food that forest dwelling wildlife need. This in turn causes forest habitat loss. Forest edge effects extend over 300 feet into the interior of forests. And so what that looks like is here are those fragments, and then you have the edge effects. Sorry, my light goes off automatically. It's going to be off. Okay. This is what these edge effects look like in terms of reducing the amount of wildlife habitat. They typically extend 300 feet to the interior. So you can see that all that the wildlife have left are these two forest patches here. And those are the ones that depend on the interior of forests. This is what that looks like in a more rural area that is becoming suburban. So anything in green is the interior forest that remains for forest dwelling wildlife to survive in. So you see how much reduced it is. And then these are the other major hazards associated with development. So you say to yourself, I see a lot of wildlife. Yes, we see mostly generalist species that do live in these forest edges. They thrive in urbanizing areas. And we don't often see the specialist or area sensitive species that are more threatened because of this habitat fragmentation. They need large areas of quality habitat, so you don't see them in your backyard usually. And they decline in rural areas that are becoming suburban, and also because of the associated lack of habitat restoration and management. So we have about 1,000 vertebrate species in North Carolina, and over a third of these vertebrate species are in significant decline. We call them species of greatest conservation need. Those are those area sensitive or specialist wildlife especially. The development patterns and the habitat fragment that are associated with the habitat fragmentation are the top threat. So working forests such as yours and local government land use planning is essential to the future of our wildlife. This data is from the 2020 census. The area in green is one home to every 3 to 16 acres. We suggest that these areas are rural and becoming suburban. From a wildlife perspective, the area in green is undergoing significant habitat fragmentation and loss. And then this is what is predicted for 2030 based on past growth trends. The orange here is what was the light green in the previous image. Orange represents one house to every 1 to 15 acres. And these are the areas that are experiencing that high habitat fragmentation with spread out development. So our state is in the top 10 fastest growing states every year. And North Carolina contains more sprawl areas than any other state. This is what one house to every 1 to 15 acres looks like. And so you can, that orange in the previous map, so you can see that there's not much forest interior, if any, in most of those places. So here are some more growth and land use trends. In the last 10 years, our population grew by nearly 10%, almost 10.5 million people now, and we're due to have 3.2 million more people by 2050. So we got our work cut out for us. Our major cities have developed over 5 times more land per new resident now than in the 1970s. So we're using more land than we need to in development. So we could have the same amount of development using less land. And that would benefit us because these common spread out patterns of development cost twice as much in property taxes. Our land mass is 34.5 million acres. And of that, 14% is currently classified as developed by the USDA. Our population growth rate is comparable to the rate of increase in developed land. So 30% of streams are now classified as impaired. So your land definitely matters. Things are potentially getting slightly better. However, the recent statistics show that we're now developing about an average of 67,000 acres of farms and forests every year. And that recently used to be 100,000 acres of farms and forests each year. So it might be getting better. And it looks like now we're developing half an acre of land per new resident, whereas recently we were developing an acre of land per new resident. So things may be getting better. The typical spread out pattern of development and land use has created 2.3 million acres that are at risk for moderate to major impacts from wildfires to people and their homes. This also indicates a lot of the habitat fragmentation from development. So this area in orange is the wild urban intermix here, which is not so much suburban, but that, you know, rural kind of landscape with lots of houses. We also have an associated decline in native forest types across the state. And since 2002, shortleaf pine forests have declined 33%. The historic range of longleaf pine is down 95%. And open canopy forests pose less wildfire threat and are essential to the future of our wildlife. So we can mitigate some of these declines in native forest types just by opening up forests as much as possible. However, for wildlife, it's better to be surrounded by production forest, such as in this image, because then you don't have your edge effects. And it's much better that working forests of any kind are on the landscape and the landscape isn't changing to development. So forests only offer sufficient wildlife food resources if they have relatively open canopies and areas with large open canopy gaps, such as those created by fallen mature trees. This allows sunlight to reach the forest floor, which allows wildflowers and native grasses to grow in the forest understory. The best way to avoid wildfires and provide a lot of this wildlife habitat from open canopy forests is to do prescribed burning. Areas that are not burned are too thick, creating wildfire hazard and little food. So prescribed burning is done in a low intensity during low risk weather, controlled by certified landowners and professionals. So it's low risk. It's a natural process, so it's good for wildlife habitat. This is the amount of prescribed burning that was done assisted by the North Carolina Forest Service, most of it between 2015 and 2020. And so I just want to show, that, we could increase the amount of prescribed fire on the landscape and that would be beneficial. There are landowner prescribed burning associations that you can look into and get certified if you're interested. And those are improving things. And then my last slide is just to say that a main challenge is being able to conduct prescribed fire because wind direction needs to be blowing away from homes. And so when you have limits on your prescribed burning, that increases wildfire risk and minimizes habitat condition or minimizes the amount of good wildlife habitat management you can do. So forest fragmentation is also reducing the ability to restore and manage forests for wildlife habitat, but we're working on these challenges. And with that, I guess I'll take any questions now, is my understanding.
Yes, thank you so much, Casey. I know that's just a lot of really deep, sometimes disturbing information about what's going on with development and the threats to wildlife and natural lands. But fortunately, that information is kind of what helps motivates us to do conservation and do something. So that's a really important piece of the puzzle. If anybody has questions for Casey, we've got a few minutes. You can raise your hand with the reaction button, or you can type into the chat and Casey will answer your questions. So I'll give you all a minute or two to see if you have any questions. That's a lot to absorb.
Yeah.
Admittedly, these are the types of things that keep conservation professionals awake at night and what drives us to do what we do for our jobs. So it's important stuff to keep in mind. I see a hand from Krista.
Yeah, quick question. I'm actually a relatively new North Carolina convert. I came from Colorado, where wildfires are a constant threat, and I've watched them get worse over my lifetime. So I guess my question is, how does a landowner organize or find resources to do controlled burns? And how do we know where to do controlled burns?
A good one-stop shop is your North Carolina Forest Service local office. So you go to their website. And then there's also the North Carolina Prescribed Burning Association, and they have a lot of resources as well, but your district ranger for the North Carolina Forest Service can give you a lot of information, as well as, Wildlife Commission folks like myself, but their websites are most set up to be a good place to start if you're starting with a website. And actually on the North Carolina Forest Service website, I believe the prescribed burning associations are listed, and you can look at taking the classes that you need to. They provide that training. So that's on their website too.
Cool. So there was a question from Shelley about, are you advocating for us to do prescribed burning on our land? I would hazard to say that the answer is yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, I can understand how folks can be hesitant about it for sure. The landowners that I've been in touch with over the years, they start from that place of caution, which is very smart. And then now I see them, the North Carolina Forest Service does a lot of burning for private landowners. So you've got professionals that can do it. And so it definitely encouraged, but understand, reservations folks have. There's other ways to keep your forests open too. You can just do thinning and things like that. But for those that are comfortable with it, it's a wonderful way to provide wildlife habitat.
There's a question from Stacy about, I guess her audio cut out when you were talking about creeks. Could you repeat what you said specifically about creeks?
It was just the statistic from the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality that 30% of our streams are classified as impaired. And a lot of that is associated with urbanization.
Got one from Karen. Are there management practices that we can do to make forest edges more compatible for wildlife?
Absolutely. You can do this thing called feathering, edge feathering, where you, instead of just having this hard forest edge where it's like trees and then open, you encourage or allow shrubs to grow in. So you don't mow all the way up to the edge of the forest. You just kind of leave an area to grow up in shrubs. And then you just have to watch that your mature trees don't start growing in that. So you cut out your mature tree, or not mature trees, but tall trees in that feathered edge. Yeah, feathered edges are really great because a lot of the species that use the open habitats and the forest habitats can really, that's a higher quality habitat for them.
Awesome. Avoid that really hard edge of completely open to completely forest, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think we might have time for just one more question before we want to go into the next part of the webinar. Somebody asked, Stacy, what is there planting we should do of certain trees or certain types of trees?
You can definitely to arrest the decline in the native forest types. So you can find out from the Wildlife Commission or the North Carolina Forest Service what is the native forest type of your region if you're having trouble finding that information, and then they can assist you with planting. There's a lot of longleaf pine planting going on. There's some shortleaf pine planting. And yes, that's definitely part of the picture.
Great, awesome. I think we should start moving on to the next series of presentations. Thank you so much, Casey, for taking your time to put that presentation together for us and to get us really, really motivated to do something about the problem. So we're going to move on to our next portion, which is, okay, so what role does your land play in the solution? And our first presenter, Rachel Urbanek, who's with the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, couldn't make it today. I think she's actually on vacation right now, but she pre-recorded her presentation. So I'm going to get us set up for that, and we will be able to hear her presentation, which is about wildlife habitat and corridors. And she won't be available to answer questions during the Q&A, but if you guys have any questions during her presentation and send them in the chat, then we will make sure those get to her so that she can answer them for you later. So let me get myself set up here. I'm going to reshare my screen. Hopefully, can everybody see Rachel's presentation here?
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. I don't have the little green box that says that I'm successfully sharing. So, all right, let's get into it.
Hey everyone, my name is Rachel Urbanek. I'm a certified wildlife biologist in the Department of Environmental Sciences at UNCW. And I got invited today to talk about forest wildlife habitat and corridors. Wish I could be there live via Zoom with you this week, but I'm actually going to become full professor and department chair of the department in July. So I'm taking this time for a little bit of a break before all that happens. So without ado, I'm going to take off my camera and I'll present the rest of the information. On the last slide, I have my contact information in case you have any questions or I can help you in any way. So I'm just going to start off with a very, very brief overview and history of our forests in our nation. So again, just starting off with an extremely brief history of U.S. forests. We started off before European colonization, so before 1650, and 2/3 of what our country is now was forested. And there were both natural and man-made disturbances happening on all these forests. Natural being the same things that happen today, like floods and hurricanes, tornadoes, but Native Americans were also making man-made disturbances to create their own civilizations, but not to necessarily the degree at all after European settlers came. The next 300 years saw massive clearing, up to 28% decline in our forests across the nation. And then from 1950 to 1980, particularly along our eastern side of the United States, our farms actually start transitioning to early successional forests. So they started growing back as we abandoned our smaller farms. And eventually in a lot of our areas, we have secondary growth forests. So these are forests that don't necessarily look like they did pre-European colonization, but they still look like forests. And then from 1980 until today, we're experiencing the biggest threats from just development in general, whether that through urbanization and sprawl or commercial agriculture. The other major thing that has really shaped our forests in this nation is fire. Fire is a natural element on the landscape, and historically, it occurred depending on different parts of the country every 4 years to every 100 years, depending on the composition of the plants and the different climate. Native Americans did accelerate it to some degree in order to create their civilizations in agriculture, as we've seen from soil cultures and seeing these fire pits. But we probably did the most amount of damage with our decades-long campaign of Smokey Bear suppressing those natural forest fires. Now we know that forest fires and prescribed burns, which we do purposely now to rehabilitate and restore our forests, are extremely important for the health of our ecosystem. So as I said, urbanization, agriculture, and just development in general are the major threats to our forests. But I want to explain a little bit of those current threats and how that actually creates consequences for our wildlife. And this really comes down to habitat fragmentation. So in the blue here, it's just the definition, breaking apart of continuous habitat. And just so that you know, what is habitat? Habitat consists of 4 basic things. It's food, it's water, it's shelter, and it's space. And really one thing that you need to be considerate of is habitat is different for all species. So habitat for a white-tailed deer is different than habitat for, let's say, a red-cockaded woodpecker. And as a result of habitat fragmentation, we end up getting what's called habitat loss and an introduction of a matrix. Habitat loss is just large areas of continuous forest, in this case, converted to some other land use. So again, urban sprawl, development, agriculture. And then an introduction of a matrix is just inhospitable area, like a community, like agricultural land, something that a species generally doesn't inhabit. The important thing to remember, though, is just because habitat is species specific, then habitat loss and the introduction of the matrix and how those species are affected by these changes is also species specific. So I just want to take you down what's considered just the generalization of how this type of fragmentation can affect species. And we can categorize wildlife in a whole lot of different ways. We can consider them wildlife specialists who need to have certain types of habitat or types of food. We can have habitat generalists that can live a lot of different places and are pretty flexible. But when we think about fragmentation and its effects on wildlife species, we often think about interior species and edge species. And so on the left side here is just a quick little diagram of looking at maybe an intact forest. So the entire kind of squiggly blob. We have some species in the dark green that are interior species. They really like large patches or large areas of forest, and they don't like to be near that matrix or other kind of vegetation. And then the ones in the lighter color are edge species. They don't mind being near two different kinds of habitat or land uses. They don't mind being by agriculture and forest, or maybe a community and forest. When we have fragmentation, we get to the right side of things, where we just basically split, as the simplest way, one piece of habitat in half. And as you can see, the interior habitat and those species are usually the first things that start decreasing. So you can think of them also as specialists, that they really need to have large spaces of forest. And then on the outside of it are the edge habitat species. And they tend to increase because, again, we get more edge. We get more of that combination of two different kinds of land uses, which these kind of animals don't mind. So given all that, what can you do as a landowner to help provide wildlife habitat in your forested areas or your forest patches? The first thing to consider is that not all animals want to be in a forest. So on the very bottom for the vegetation is just a diagram of what I've been meaning by succession, going from a grass or a field eventually into more vegetation, taller vegetation, and then eventually a high tree or secondary forest. The orange lines here just indicate examples of where different species live and what they're associated with. Obviously, some like grass, where some like just all wooded areas. And so you're not going to have habitat for all species at all times. So if you choose to clear cut on your land or clear cut areas of your land, you should know that in the first 1 or 2 years, your wildlife populations are definitely going to decline. You're going to miss those forested animals in those areas. They're going to leave. But what you would have, or you might actually even attract, is some of those species that really like those large open areas. As you let that land continue to grow back, you'll start getting that early successional habitat. So grasses will start forming, shrubs, saplings will start growing, and you'll actually start attracting a large variety of animals. Things anywhere from grouse to bear to deer, and like that have big flexibility in their habitat. And then when you get to later successional habitat, areas that have a dense tree canopy and there's not a lot of undergrowth or suppressed structure underneath the canopy, that's actually where you start having a little bit less wildlife. So you'll have specialists more like some fox species, some wood ducks, different types of owl species that really enjoy that more interior type of forested habitat. An obvious alternative to clear cutting is some kind of partial logging. Often that's done in 10 to 25% of the stand is disturbed at any given time, and there's much longer times, like 5 to 10 years between the harvests. And so you can choose these types of silviculture practices based on opening size or similar characteristics of the trees themselves. But one thing to keep in mind is how close these patches are that you're cutting, as well as what type of fragmentation is occurring across the entire landscape of your forest. So going back into those interior versus edge species and considering what the effects might be on the wildlife before you make your plan. So I mentioned suppressed structure a few slides ago, and I just kind of want to give an example of what structure is in terms of the biological sense. So here's just kind of a quick diagram of a forest, and you see these black lines across. Each of these lines kind of gives you a level of the forest. So the very bottom line is the grasses, and then you get to like a little bit taller grasses and maybe some shrubs, and then saplings, and then we get to mid-story and above story. And this is what we mean about structure in a forest. The more different kinds of levels we have on the vertical side of a forest, the more habitat is available for different kinds of species. There are some species that like to be on the ground, there's some species that like to be in the middle area, and there's some species that like to live up in the canopy. And so having vertical structure is a pretty key component of good forest wildlife habitat. If you do want to provide more foraging trees available, overstory trees that are beech, oak, cherry, or dogwood, they'll provide perching, nesting, and foraging opportunities, particularly those that produce mast or nuts or berries as food resources. If you happen to live in the western side of North Carolina where it actually does get cold, keeping the pines, any kind of spruce or hemlock would be really good as a thermal refuge for wildlife during the winter time as well. And as I mentioned earlier, prescribed burns on forested lands can be really valuable, particularly if you have longleaf pine. One thing that you should know is that direct mortality of wildlife is pretty uncommon. Large mammals tend to leave, and small mammals, especially ones that can burrow, will seek refuge underground. In fact, we often use prescribed fires to manage habitat for game species, things like grouse, white-tailed deer, and elk. So if you're looking to enhance your habitat for those kind of species, prescribed fires would be a good way to do that. So obviously a part of forest habitat conservation is providing corridors, which are simply just strips of vegetation linking one patch or one area of the same like vegetation to another. So if you look at this, we've got a corridor right here that's connecting one forest patch to another. And these are really important in terms of adding connectivity to the landscape. So corridors really help protect landscape connectivity for wildlife. So one thing that you might want to consider is protecting corridors that are already present on your land, or trying to fill gaps or restore connections through these ideas of maybe stepping stone patches of small forested areas or critical gaps, identifying where they are and trying to fill in that with a little bit of forests. One thing to consider is your forest corridor actually effective? Just because you have a strip of vegetation of forest that connects two different patches, it might provide just this structural connectivity, where that physical arrangement of the forest is actually there. But if you consider the fact that if you're looking at these pictures, this corridor might only be 2 meters or like 6 feet wide, it's not going to provide a lot of habitat for larger animals. Consider one that's like on the right side, where it actually even provides water and true habitat. And we kind of think of that as functional connectivity. So I like to think about what size animals might need those corridors through the forest. The one on the left might be fine for a turtle or a frog, but the one on the right would probably be needed for a white-tailed deer or a bear to provide that safe corridor between forests. On a much smaller scale, conserving tiny habitat features in your forest are really critical too to helping with wildlife habitat. Rocky outcrops often help with different types of rodent species as well as reptile species, and then keeping some kind of ephemeral wetlands. The wetlands that come and go through the seasons are really important for amphibians as well. So snags are really good because they're usually filled with insects, and that's awesome for woodpeckers and their allies. They also provide good cavity nesting and roosting sites, like that picture I just showed you of the raccoon. And then, of course, resting sites in general for mammals that can climb trees. Down deadwood is often used for hunting perches, mammalian resting sites, and then avian courtship. For example, rough grouse use down deadwood as perches so that they can have their ritual of drumming and having that sound from their wings echo into the forest. And finally, I just want you to consider any kind of riparian zones in your area. Anywhere you have creeks or streams, tree removal near your streams can really damage habitat for terrestrial wildlife, but it also can harm aquatic organisms. If you think about it, you're basically taking away the shade from the water, and so your temperature of that water is going to increase. But then removing those trees also increases soil coming into that water, and sedimentation changes the water. So it's generally suggested anywhere from 100 to 250 foot buffers around those riparian areas so that you don't log near them to mitigate any effects. And that's all I have for you. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. I'll be happy to talk with you. My contact information again is down there below, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your webinar.
Awesome. So, wow, I feel like I just relived like the first couple years of my undergraduate degree in wildlife biology. That was an awesome introduction about habitats and what wildlife need to live and thrive. So again, we're going to hold questions until the end for like a bigger Q&A. So we're going to go right into a next presentation by the wonderful and amazing Liz Snyder, who is with NC State University, and she's going to talk about ecosystem services, or the benefits to humans and to natural areas. So take it away, Liz.
Thank you, Fallon. Hi, everybody. It's great to see you. I see we've got like over 80 or 90 participants here, I assume across the state. So that's great. I'm going to share my screen and okay, do you all see the full screen setting there?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, so again, yes, Elizabeth Snyder. I'm the forest manager at the College of Natural Resources at NC State University. We've got 10 forests actually, and I'm over about 9 of them, which is 13,000 acres. That does not count our 79,000 acre Hoffman Forest out on the coast. But I'm here to talk a little bit about ecosystem services that healthy working forests provide. And I just threw this presentation together last night just to give you something pretty to look at really, but it's nothing terribly technical. But whatever your management objectives are, a significant goal is maintaining healthy ecosystems, I'm sure. And I think we'll all agree that doing so makes human life and other life possible and more enjoyable. So first, what is a healthy, resilient forest? I like to ask school-age children when we're giving tours or meeting at the schools, why do we manage forests? Well, we want to prevent diseases and pests, control invasive plant species, and generally sway the forest growth and composition to promote whatever the landowner's objectives may be, whether that's timber, recreation, wildlife, etc., or a mix of all of the above. So a healthy managed forest can withstand or bounce back from disaster with vigor. These pictures on the left, it shows an overdense, what we call a dog hair stand, versus on the right is a pre-commercial thinning operation. And we do a pre-commercial thin to prevent competition and mortality, any diseases, insect outbreaks, and it's also just easier to monitor and manage while at the same time promoting crop trees. And then what exactly is a managed forest? Again, managed to whatever the landowner's objectives may be. And this may involve some level of harvesting, replanting, restoration, tending, just manipulating the forest by mimicking natural disturbance such as fire. And we know a forest left to grow naturally may not necessarily be a healthy forest. So most organizations all recognize 4 categories of ecosystem services. One is provisional services or materials used by humans and other life. There's the services that help regulate the environment, and then supporting services that provide for all other ecological services. And then cultural and health services that enhance the quality of life. So we'll look at those one by one. With your provisional services, again, these are benefits that people and other life get from forest ecosystems. So there's fresh water, medicinal resources such as teas, herbs, oils, extracts, and even enhancements in medical research. Food, such as plant material, mushrooms, deer, quail, fish, and then even raw materials such as ingredients, dyes, fiber, wood, and firewood for fuel. Some examples of regulation services include, improving air quality, improving water quality, and with water quality, this includes maintaining transpiration rates, keeping moisture local in the roots, in the soil, in the litter, in the trees, and in the atmosphere, and also better regulation of water flow and therefore flood protection across the landscape. This is also maintaining aquatic ecosystems, and we're learning or have known for a while now that forests can be the answer for wastewater treatment in small communities by way of removing pathogens, nutrients, and suspended solids. Of course, there's carbon sequestration and storage. So capturing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and storing it long-term in the roots, in the trees, and even maybe longer term in lumber. There is soil protection with erosion control, and you're maintaining soil fertility. And the decomposition of expired plant and animal materials, which lends to nutrient cycling at the landscape level. We are supporting pollinators and diverse plants and crops. And therefore, a healthy forest can support a balance of biotic life to prevent outbreaks of pest and disease in the sense of natural biological control, if you're familiar with that term. All of this helps balance the local climate. Also think of the impact of shade being provided on the impact on temperature and moisture. And all of this contributing on a larger scale, a moderation of extreme events. Okay, your supporting services are necessary for the production of all other ecosystem services. These allow the land to sustain basic life forms. So you may be providing one type of habitat or a mosaic of varied types and ages. The idea of an ecotone, and this is sort of the transitional area that Rachel was talking about between two different ecosystems. So in this image here, you've got the deciduous forest system on the left, providing for those specialty species, and then your grassland species on the right. Bring those together to that ecotone area in the center of the transitional zone, and you might be providing for both species from both habitats, and therefore doubling the amount of species in those areas. So providing the living space and open space for plants and animals, and to some level contiguous space. You've got less walls, fences, roads, development, breaking up the landscape. If you're able to connect to neighboring properties, it can offer more space and diversity across the landscape. Then we're also providing general diversity across the landscape with down logs, snags, up to level of forest communities, whether it be forest land or wetland, meadows and prairies. And this is allowing sustainable, I guess, sustaining biodiversity and genetic resources along with, or whether we're talking about grasses, forbs, shrubs, trees, and all wildlife. And then snags, Rachel mentioned snags. So these are used for nests, nurseries, storage areas, foraging, roosting, and perching by birds, small mammals, and then insects, lichen, and fungi are moving in as well. Depending on who you talk to and what area you're in, wildlife specialists may suggest 3 to up to 30 snags left per acre if you're able to do that. But even just one is helpful. And then also thinking of, still on these supporting services, protection from light pollution, because many of your animals and insects and even plants need natural diurnal and nocturnal cycles. And then getting into cultural services and these non-material benefits that people gain from ecosystems. We've got, of course, recreation, which promotes physical health and to some level potential for community. Tourism, such as maybe tree farm tours, ecotourism. These are for educational or cultural enrichment. And again, physical health. And all of these, along with all the material services I mentioned, will be enhancing your local economy. We've also got your mental health to think about, spiritual or cultural experiences and well-being. If you've heard the idea of forest bathing, which is not necessarily taking a bath in the woods, but surrounding yourself by natural areas and immersing yourself in the forest, and also unplugging from the daily grind. This does wonders for you. This picture in the center was a women's group, and there's Fallon showing off a snake on our hike, but we were headed to the woods to do some forest bathing and had a great time that day. Aesthetics, we're providing inspiration for engineering, architecture, music, culture, and other arts and design. Can also provide a sense of place. So these are areas that hold special meaning, worth caring about. And then altogether, management for these things gives us a sense of purpose. So I was hoping to bring up services that you hadn't thought about maybe, or that you didn't realize you might already be providing. All of these enhance positive well-being and quality of life for all occupants. And that's all I've got for you right now. I think the next presenters will dive into some of those in more depth. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Liz. That's it's really, I think it's easy to forget about the fact that healthy forests do a lot of work. We can take that for granted, but every little piece of a healthy working forest or non-working forest is part of, the whole big picture of life being healthy and thriving. So thank you for that. We're gonna go next to a really, really exciting sort of piece of that puzzle of healthy land, and that's water quality. So we're gonna have Maria Polizzi from the North Carolina Forest Service talk about water quality for the forest landowner. And so I'll just turn it over to Maria. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Let me get my PowerPoint up and running here. Give me a second. All right. My name is Maria Polizzi. Hopefully you can see my slides. I'm with the North Carolina Forest Service as the Forest Water Quality Senior Specialist, and I'm going to be talking about water quality today. So I think some of my stuff has been touched on a bit already, but I'll try to give you guys a little bit more in depth. So what makes forests so beneficial when it comes to water quality and water resources? So forests store a lot of water, both in the trees and in the soil. It's apparently oak trees can take up to 400 gallons of water per day in the summertime. So that is a lot of water that's being stored in the forests. And also it helps to decrease runoff by slowing the water down as it moves across the landscape, which can help to mitigate flooding because water is reaching the streams more slowly. Forests also act as a filter. So you've probably heard about buffers or riparian areas. And the reason, or one of the reasons that we leave a strip of forest alongside waterways is because they are a great filter. They help to prevent pollutants from reaching those water bodies. And it also helps to prevent erosion. So the tree roots themselves hold on to the soil. The leaf litter, the canopy cover helps to slow raindrops as they hit the soil. And another benefit of that is that you're keeping your nutrients in place as well, right? So your nutrients are in the soil, and those are very valuable to your trees. That goes right into your site index. You don't want to be losing your nutrients to the water. Not only is it beneficial for your landscape, but it's also beneficial for the water quality as well, because nutrients can be a form of pollution in the water if they get to elevated levels. And as has been touched on already, provides a habitat for native plants and animals, both terrestrial and aquatic. So the shade, the higher water quality, a lot of our threatened and endangered species, especially the aquatic ones, require very high water quality. And part of the reason why they're threatened and endangered is because water quality is becoming diminished in a lot of areas. So our forested streams are exceptionally important for having those higher water quality areas that can sustain those habitats. All right, so I threw this slide up here just to kind of give you an idea of how forests can play varying roles depending on their location and scale. So obviously, when you're thinking about inner city forests, that's going to be very different than when you're thinking about very large forests further out into the countryside. So in the inner city, you might be thinking about stormwater control, erosion control, stuff like that, just aesthetics. And then you get further out and you're looking at more of regulating water supply, increased water quality, as I mentioned, and that flood control. So there's a lot of different services on different scales, and all of them are important and for different reasons. Also, a significant amount of our drinking water comes from forested watersheds, right? So when we maintain water quality on forests, even if you think, oh, it's just one stream, what is it really going to do? But you know, somebody downstream might be drinking that water. So what you are able to do with your land really does matter. All right, so then getting into some risks to forest water quality. And I'm going to be talking specifically about harvests for this section, because that is where there is the most risk to water quality. As I was just discussing, there's so many benefits from having those trees there, but when we're removing them, there are risks. So what are some of those risks? Of course, sediment, as I already touched on, from erosion, pesticides and fertilizers as well, and fuels, oils, and other chemicals are all potential risks. So what can we do? Well, plan with water quality in mind. Consult with trusted experts, whether that is the Forest Service or consulting forester, maybe it's just your neighbor that's got a lot of experience. You know, reach out to people. Implement best management practices, and I'll get into that a little bit more in a minute here. And just be aware of what's going on in your property. Walk it over, you know, make sure that you're correcting issues regularly. And if it's not you, make sure that you have someone that you can trust that is doing that. Just knowing what's going on is always a good thing. All right, so pre-harvest planning. So the first step in protecting water resources is knowing where they are. So you can use soil or topographical maps to identify water resources that are on your site. And also, it's a really good idea to walk your property and locate these in the field. So the soil and topo maps might give you a great idea of where to look, but they're not always 100% accurate, so it's good to check them in the field. And again, if you're not sure or you don't feel comfortable doing that, you can consult with an expert as needed, and they would be happy to assist you. Also, a good idea is determining where you're going to put, you know, roads, skid trails, crossings, etc., before you actually are going to do it. So especially stream crossings, that's the area of highest risk, as you might imagine, because you're actually going to be intersecting that stream channel. So knowing where you're going to put those ahead of time is a really good idea, minimizing the number of stream crossings, stuff like that. And then making sure that you communicate what your plans are to your other project stakeholders, whether that's your contractor, consultant, if you have one. Make sure that they know what your objectives are and what your plans are. And I've also included a picture here of our pre-harvest planning tool. It's a free tool that's available on our website, and it can kind of help you pull together some of these various resources, such as the soil and the topographical maps that I mentioned. It also gives you a heads up if there's any threatened endangered species on your tract. You can actually draw out where you might want to place roads, skid trails, other BMPs, etc. It's a really great tool. I highly recommend checking it out if you have a chance. All right, BMPs and FPGs, what are they? In a really condensed A couple minutes here. All right, so BMPs, or best management practices, are essentially just tools in your toolbox on protecting water quality. So we have a BMP manual. It's available on our website and it was recently updated. So it's got all the best, newest recommendations. That's anything from installing check dams or how to install roads, which type of stream crossing would be best for your tract. So, you know, here in North Carolina, we have a lot of diversity in our landscape. So if you have property in the coastal plain, it's going to look very different than if you have property in the mountains. So not all of them are going to apply to your site, but we have a lot of different recommendations for various types of land and land management that could be useful on your particular site. So FPGs, or forest practice guidelines, those are the mandatory performance standards that are authorized by the North Carolina Sedimentation and Pollution Control Act. So these are actually the regulations, and there's 9 for water quality. Unfortunately, I don't have time to get into the details of that today, but all of that information is also included in our BMP manual and on our website. And essentially, these are just performance standards. They're not going to tell you how to meet them, essentially. And that's what the BMPs are for. The BMPs are the tools to help you make sure that you're meeting the performance standards of the FPGs. All right, so what can we do to maintain water quality during harvest? So make sure that your BMPs are functioning and that your FPGs are met. You might need to add additional BMPs or adjust ones that you have, potentially even do some maintenance. So you've got your check dam is full of sediment. You might want to pull that sediment out of there so that it can continue to function properly. Mark your water resources on your site, and that includes your SMZs as well, streamside management zones. So even if you've told your contractor, hey, this is the stuff to watch out for, it's possible that they forget, or maybe something got lost in translation. So just having everything marked on the site is a really good idea to just avoid confusion and make sure that those resources are being protected. And then just a couple other notes on buffer rules. So buffer rules are managed by the Division of Water Resources. So that's not us, the Forest Service, but we do try to make people aware that those do exist. So there are certain watersheds within North Carolina that are required to have buffers around their streams, which are different from the streamside management zones that are part of the North Carolina Forest Service FPGs. So just be aware, make sure that you know beforehand, before a harvest, if you have a buffer rule that applies to your project. Information about that is also available on our website and in our BMP manual. Similarly, if you're going to be doing a timber harvest in a wetland, there are some additional rules and regulations for that as well that are implemented by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. This is also included in the BMP manual, so if you've got questions or concerns, make sure to look at the additional requirements for that type of harvest. All right, and then what type of maintenance might you need to do after harvest? This is also a really critical time period because trees don't grow back overnight, right? And that's going to be your best and most permanent solution to maintaining water quality, preventing erosion, all of that type of stuff. Stabilization is really key. So having something on the ground covering up that soil, preventing the erosion in the meantime is really, really important. So whether it's seed and straw in some of your high risk areas or slash, those are all great ways to just cover up that soil so that your water is slowing down and spreading out rather than quickly moving across the soil and eroding. So here's a picture of a rehabilitated stream crossing area. And as you can see, you're not seeing any bare soil. They've got some grass that's coming up and got a lot of good slash. And they've also removed, which I think was probably bridge mats in this case. So make sure you're removing temporary devices like that as well. All right, and my contact information is here if you have any questions. And I think we will be taking some more questions here in a minute. So thank you all.
Thank you so much, Maria. Boy, I don't think there's anything that is more sort of viscerally, deeply understandable in terms of a primary need that we have than clean water. And I think we all deeply understand that it's something that we need. But I'm sure most people want to ask, like, well, how in the world can we keep our water clean? Turns out all sorts of amazing techniques are available to keep our water clean and healthy. So thank you so much for that quick introduction to a lot of techniques. We probably will go a little bit more into some of those in one of our subsequent webinars for the year. So hope you can join us for one of those. We're doing great on time. Next, we've got our final professional presentation of the day before our Q&A. So gear up those questions, write them down if you need to. You can just stick them in the chat if you want to, and we'll get to them later. But our last but not least, by all means, is our second professional conservationist, Liz Rutledge. She's with the North Carolina Wildlife Federation, and she's going to talk to us a little bit about the quality of life and the human health and wellness that healthy forests and healthy land provide. So take it away, Liz.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much, Fallon. So some of this will be a little bit of a recap from some of the information that the other speakers shared. And can you guys see my presentation?
Yep, looks great, Liz.
All right, perfect. And so we will just get started. So I am the Director of Wildlife Resources with the North Carolina Wildlife Federation. So we are a nonprofit NGO that, as you can see at the bottom, NCWF has been protecting, conserving, and restoring North Carolina wildlife and habitat since 1945. And I'm going to speak to you guys about quality of life, human health, and wellness as it relates to the environment and what you can do with your property. All right, so the first slide here, what makes us healthy, happy, and whole? So a lot of times now we hear more and more conversation about physical health as well as mental health. And so when we think about the outdoors, we think about a lot of physical health, including multiple types of outdoor recreation, kayaking, hunting, angling, biking, camping, all kinds of things that are good for your physical health. And then we also think of mental health. So those could be things like nature therapy. A lot of people find solace in gardening and planting their own native species, things like that. Wildlife viewing can be very beneficial to your mental health, and just being outside in the woods allows for a time for reflection. A lot of folks tend to enjoy being outside with family and friends, and that adds a lot to their mental and physical health. It's also a well-known fact that being outdoors can reduce stress. So definitely take that time to get outside and kind of enjoy. So the next slide here, what is your relationship with land? And I underline your for this particular slide. And you'll notice too, I don't have pictures in this presentation, and I wanted you guys to be able to kind of use that space to envision your own relationship with your land. What does it look like? How does it feel to you? What is important to you? And so a little bit related to that would be connection and culture. So we'll start out with connection. So how connected do you feel to your land, and how did that develop? That could be something like the property you grew up on. Say you grew up on a farm and you had a lot of interaction with the outdoors or wildlife. And so later on in life, you want to kind of recreate that connection that you had when you were younger. And a little bit here, I put culture as well, because a lot of that, people's backgrounds and where they're from and what they associate that with has a lot to do with their culture. And one of the obvious examples that we think about a lot of times are tribal lands, indigenous people who associate a lot with the outdoors and wildlife. So some folks have a very, very strong cultural connection to the outdoors. And so one of the things, kind of the outdoors and nature in itself, it's something larger than yourself. It's something where a lot of people find a lot of spiritual connection, which leads to some of those health benefits and just relaxing and reducing stress. The historical context that I had here was a little bit about what is your history with the land? What is kind of that background that guides you to the objectives that you have today for how you want to manage your land? And I also put food production here because a lot of times, especially in this day and time, a lot of people are disconnected from where their food is actually produced and how the environment plays a role in that. And so anything from agriculture and pollinators, pollinating agricultural crops that provide food for folks to eat, as well as the harvest of wild game for consumption. So that could be through hunting and angling. And then a lot of people also, when you think about your relationship, you can't not think about the next generation, the next generation. So some of you may have children, grandchildren, cousins, uncles, everything. And that may be really tied to some of your management goals, especially if your management goals are to spend more time outdoors or hunting and angling, things like that. All right, so how does nature play a role in human health? And so some of the previous speakers went over some of the ecosystem benefits. I do want to stress that ecosystems, everything's interconnected. So when you talk about air, water, soil, the plants, habitat, basically you can boil it down to starting at the beginning with soil. And I have soil underlined here because a lot of times your soil composition determines your plant composition, which then determines your wildlife composition. And so these ecosystem benefits that we've talked about, we all need air to breathe, we all need water to drink, and then we all need food to eat. And everything that we have comes from nature. And so a little bit just talking about food chains again. So everything is dependent upon trophic levels. So you have different species that feed off of different trophic levels. And so as you go up the trophic level, you basically get smaller and smaller. And so up at the top, people require a lot of food. And so with agriculture, that's an important benefit for us to keep a clean environment, and air and water is for our food source. I've also got sustainability here, not just sustainability for ourselves as humans, but also sustainability for biodiversity. So one of the things that makes ecosystems healthy are having a multitude of different species present in a multitude of different habitats. And that's extremely important. We wouldn't have much luck living in a super monoculture society where we only have one or two species of tree or plant or food, things like that. And then sustainability for future generations. Like I mentioned earlier, a lot of folks, as you get older, you have a focus on what can I do for the next generation? And land management is a great avenue to do things for the future. And then I want to make sure I mention here public trust resources. So a public trust resource is a resource that belongs to everyone. And so we typically think of wildlife species as public trust resources. So whether you're harvesting deer or you're fishing and consuming fish that you catch or shrimp or whatnot, these are public trust resources belonging to everyone. And once again, everything comes from nature. So when you think about the things around you, you look around your house and everything, every item that you have almost is essentially something that has some sort of natural product within it. And so respect, appreciation, and responsibility. So respect and appreciation are very beneficial to health and well-being associated with wildlife and the environment. Having an appreciation for what's around us, a respect for what it provides, and then in turn, we take responsibility for those resources on our lands. And I'll just go through a few challenges just in general. The other speakers hit these pretty well and did a really great job. So as we know, human population growth. So North Carolina, our population is growing. A lot of that leads to further division of property, which would be habitat fragmentation. I think one of the other speakers mentioned you may have an increase in neighbors as habitat becomes more fragmented. Connectivity issues, especially for wildlife, habitat and wildlife. So anytime that we can maintain connectivity between habitat types and movement for specific species, then we basically eliminate that need to have some sort of mitigation strategy. And a lot of times in my work as a wildlife biologist, we talk a lot about wildlife and vehicle mortality, things like that. And so it's super important to maintain that connectivity for various species. A challenge, loss of biodiversity. Biodiversity, so this could be plants, animals, this could be a lot of different types of community structure here. But I think one of the most notable lately has been the massive decrease in birds, just bird numbers in general, but insect species are also a big one for biodiversity. Sometimes we lose species that we didn't really even know we had until after they're gone. And so another challenge below that, protection of public and private lands. So we're in this kind of atmosphere where we're thinking more about the future, and we're thinking more about how to protect green spaces and places for people to interact and kind of get these benefits of physical and mental health. And so public and private lands, public lands, the more we can create, the more access there is available for everyone in the public. And then folks who own private lands, like a lot of you all do, doing those management techniques and taking care of your resources and advocating and providing a place where friends and family can also enjoy the outdoors. So access is a challenge. As we mentioned, the more that habitat becomes fragmented and the more connectivity issues we have, the fewer places there are for access. And whether that's access to public trust resources on public lands and just being able to physically access those, that can be an issue for folks. Challenging funding. So funding is always a challenge whenever you're trying to do any kind of land management. And when I say a challenge, not for everyone, but if you're looking for programs for assistance or funding, sometimes management can be on the expensive side. And so the more funding that we can get in terms of state or federal funding to help mitigate some of these issues on public and private lands, the better. And I put a slide in here real quickly for climate change, because this is something that is definitely upon us, and we've been hearing about it for decades, but we're starting to see some of the real consequences. And so I just wanted to talk about this in terms of how important it is for us to take action and to protect the environment for our mental, physical health and well-being. So climate change causes things like heat waves, heat exposure, famine, potential malnutrition. We hear in the news a lot, especially about out west, the lack of fresh water that's available. Here in the east, in North Carolina is definitely an example of sea level rise, where we're starting to see more of those ghost forests and things like that on the coast. Climate change can also cause damage to health infrastructure, and that can be from natural disasters. If you've been in North Carolina for a while, you know that we have hurricanes here, and so it can actually damage human health infrastructure. And so we expect there to be more storms and more intense storms in the future. And so anything we can do on our own personal land to help mitigate some of these kind of challenges, it's always good. Increased air pollution, and we think of a lot of air pollution from industry, things like that, which we know is not good for us to breathe in. But I also want to put in wildfires. A lot of people don't think about the air pollution that's caused by wildfires. And so the more fires that we have on the landscape, the more potential pollution. And this kind of factors into our health and well-being that we talked about, our physical health. Cardiovascular disease could be associated with lack of physical exercise, but also forms of air pollution. And we also have some crop failures, and a lot of that is due to changes in temperature and changes in rainfall and just general climate changes. All right, so now that we're over kind of a few down points there, we'll talk a little bit about what we can do as temporary stewards of our land. And especially I say temporary stewards in there because we're only here for a given amount of time. And so this is something, it's our responsibility to take care of the land while we're here and then pass it on to the next generation and instill some of these management stewardship opportunities. So properly managing your natural resources in general on private properties, that's just an amazing thing to kind of inventory what you have and manage the resources for protecting them. Minimize chemical and resource use. So sometimes we can minimize our resource use just in general, but any kind of chemical components and stuff, we talked about water quality and everything like that. So always good for people's health. Improve soil health, air and water quality. So I talked a little bit about soil health and how everything begins with the soil. And so it's super important to kind of have an idea of what types of soil you have and what that means, like if you're going to garden, if you're going to do some kind of land management, just knowing what's there. And then air and water quality. If you have some sort of water, if you have a pond or a lake or access to a river or a creek, and making sure that you maintain good water quality. Preventing erosion. This is a way to maintain good water quality. A lot of times there's nutrient contamination. So that can be from runoff from parking lots. That could be actually from wildlife. I've got here containing livestock. So those are all ways you can protect water quality, removing livestock from streams, reducing nutrient contamination from agriculture, and reducing runoff, which you can do a lot just by putting plants and trees in. Habitat wetland improvement or creation. So this may be something that's of interest to some of you on this call. When I'm riding down the road in North Carolina, I'm definitely a wildlife person, and I'm always just looking for a really awesome wetland area. I get really excited when I see these. And so anytime you have the opportunity to either improve a wetland on your area or create a wetland area or a bog or something related to hydrology, it's super awesome. Basically, wetlands filter water. And so a lot of water goes into a wetland, which will have a lot of nutrients, will have oil, different things depending on where it is. And these wetlands are like one giant big sponge that takes all the water in and slowly filters it and cleans it, which is really amazing. And I've got provide natural sources of food and cover for wildlife. So these are always things that folks can do, whether you have a backyard or you live on a large farm. There are always ways to provide sources of food, which would be specific plants or berries, milkweed for monarchs. So you think about those species that you want to target with natural food sources, and then you can put the right plants in for them. Plant natives, remove invasives. So natives provide a variety of benefits. And for me personally, I'm on the road a lot, I'm on the go a lot. So I love native plants, and I try to put in as many as I can because they're already pretty much sensitive to the current climate. So they don't have the same issues for drought and disease and things like that as some of the non-natives do, which I really appreciate. And then removing invasive species, like some of the honeysuckles, we have a lot of native options for similar plants that are invasive. So I would encourage, for example, remove Japanese honeysuckle and put in coral honeysuckle. So there are a lot of places where you can find a lot of information about native plants. We actually have the Native Plant Society in North Carolina, which you can Google and get some information there. And I know you guys are going to be moving towards how to take the first step. What do I start doing to manage my property? And so there are a lot of opportunities out there for lands. One is the Natural Resource Conservation Service, and that deals a lot with Farm Bill. So there are a lot of programs out there to protect water quality, to promote pollinators, all kinds of stuff related to private property. And so if you've ever wanted to learn more about that, some of the programs are pretty complicated, but you can take a look at the website, and then you can contact your local NRCS office and have someone help you out. It's very similar to, soil and water conservation. There are a lot of folks out there to provide that technical assistance for you. And I can't go through the rest of my presentation without kind of putting a spotlight on a few of the programs that the North Carolina Wildlife Federation has for private landowners. So we have one, for instance, called Pray for the Pack. This is down in Eastern North Carolina within a 5-county area. So if you own property within there and you want to improve habitat for wildlife, and we are specifically focused on wolves, but also other wildlife as well. We've got programs gardening for wildlife. We've probably got 6 or 7 different habitat type programs that you can find on our website that you can actually implement at home or at your local church, a community garden, things like that. We've also got Butterfly Highway, where we promote pollinators, including monarchs, most any pollinator that you want to plant native habitat for. So basically, there are a lot of great programs out there for folks, and I encourage you to take advantage of those, especially NRCS does a lot of cost share programming. And so you can actually enter a cost share agreement for a period of time. And so on the last slide here, so what I would encourage you also to share knowledge and experience with others. So something that happens to me a lot when I'm on my property, I'll plant some specific seeds or try something out, and it's a lot of trial and error. But then once I figure it out, I like to try to share that knowledge with other folks that I know. And also a couple of us at work, we will share native seeds for things. And so you can share with other folks, especially natives are a little bit harder to find. And so if you do have extra, that is a great way to build a relationship and work toward conservation. Join a conservation group. So I can't help but but the Federation out here, ncwf.org, we have a lot of different grassroots chapters across the state where folks can join and do super impactful conservation projects. And then here at the end, easements, land trusts, basically protecting land in perpetuity for the future. And so these are long-term options for folks who have property now and at some point want to make sure it's there permanently for future generations. And I've just got a little picture here from the Federation website. These are just a few of our chapters. We have about 20 chapters across the state. And here we've got Albemarle, Bull City Trailblazers, that's out of Durham, Catawba River Wildlife Coalition, Valdez, Charlotte Wildlife Stewards. So if you're interested in joining a chapter and doing projects and learning more about pollinators, feel free to check out our website. And in closing, healthy humans require a healthy environment, and it takes all of us to get that done. So I really appreciate you all being here today and being able to present. So thank you. And any questions?
All right, thank you so much, Liz. Awesome. I love that you really keyed in and sort of repeated the importance of soil health. Clean soil, healthy soil really is a fundamental basis for clean and healthy land sort of across the board, from wildlife to water to air. So thank you for highlighting that. We're going to sort of shift over into our Q&A now. Before we do, I'm going to share my screen real quick and just do a little bit of wrap up for the webinar. And so bear with me while I get that together, and then we'll have plenty of time to talk about whatever your questions are for the panelists that are still here. So let me share my screen. Okay, and now just really quick, I want to talk about some of the opportunities to connect with Forest Her. You're obviously here right now, so you probably know about at least one or two of these opportunities, but for anybody who sees the recording who wasn't able to make it today, we have a lot of ways to connect with Forest Her NC. There's a Facebook group. You can join us at Forest Her NC. Look for that, and you can post and ask questions with the Forest Her community. You can also follow us on Instagram at Forest Her NC. You can email us at foresternc@gmail.com, and we have a brand new, shiny, awesome website where you can find recordings of all of the webinars that have been recorded so far and any ones that we do in the future. So if you want to learn more about some of the topics that we've talked about in the past, then that's a really great place to delve in and kind of catch up. And that's foresternc.org. So please join us there. This webinar's recording will be on the website probably in the next few weeks or so. Also, We have a few left. We've got these great travel mugs. If you want to show off that you are a forest steward with Forester NC, you can mail a check for $22.50, which includes shipping and handling for the mug, to NC Tree Farm Program, Attention Forester NC, and we can mail you one of these super amazing mugs. My understanding is our supply is limited. There's only a few left, so get them while you can. And I'll post the address and details in the chat in a minute, or somebody else will, so that I can move on and we can do our Q&A. And I suppose with that, that is kind of the end of you guys listening to me talk. I would love to hear your questions and love to see what kind of answers our speakers have for you today. Also, before we switch over to Q&A, there will be a evaluation survey that we send to everybody who attended today. Please, if you get that email, fill it out. That helps us figure out what you guys want in the future. So we will provide the content that you request based on how you what you ask for in those surveys. So keep an eye out for that email, and please fill out the survey so that we can serve you better and give you the information you need. All right, so let's see what we've got going on in the chat, if anything. I see a hand up real quick, Lisa. So if you want to get us started with a question, that'd be great.
Okay, thank you. This was terrific. We have a 12-acre farm in Bethlehem in Alexander County. I've studied permaculture and I do organic gardening. We have a big vegetable garden, and I've put in a permaculture food forest. We also have a creek that over the years, we've been here about 8 years. In the beginning, it was about 1 inch deep and 3 feet wide, and now it's about 7 feet deep and about 50 feet wide because of erosion. We're getting huge, those big 15-inch rainfalls have been coming through, and I'm trying to work on riparian repair for the creek. Beavers have moved in, which is a good thing. So they've been building dams, but then when we get heavy rains, the dams will wash away. But they've slowed down the erosion somewhat. So currently, we don't cut our hay within about 200 feet of the creek. I'm letting all that grow up like what was suggested, and I'm specifically asking for questions about the beavers and or comments about the beavers, and also the NRCS. Would that be a group that does cost sharing that would help plant down there for putting in additional riparian plantings? Does that make sense?
And I can answer the question about the NRCS. So the best way to go about that, because all the counties are different, is to reach out to your local office and ask them directly about kind of your area. There are a lot of programs for a lot of different things, but more than likely you would have to give them a little more detailed information about your property and your objectives.
Okay. And I'm assuming that the beavers are a good thing, because I know that they're the watershed engineers. I know
can answer the beaver question.
Okay.
since I'm on the board for the Beaver Damage Management Advisory Board. So the answer to that question is, if the beavers aren't causing any type of flooding issues that are a problem for you, then they're amazing. It's really when their damming activities are flooding like roadways or homes. That's really the only time when they're an issue. Otherwise, yeah, they help provide amazingly valuable wetlands and other ways to help keep our water clean. So when they're not causing property damage, they're very good to have around.
Yeah, where they are, it's a low spot, and we're willing to lose some land because I know it's going to eventually flood more up into the pasture land, and I'm okay with that because I'd love to see a beautiful wetland going down there.
Awesome, glad to hear it.
All right, thank you. Well, I'll contact them and talk more about that with them. Thank you.
See a bunch of messages in the chat. Let's see. We've got one from Beth about written resources for HOAs to help HOA boards, understand these types of processes and what they can do to preserve wilderness, dark skies, and wildlife.
I guess I could take that question since it has something to do with development. The green growth toolbox that I had on my last slide, that is a toolbox for how to minimize impacts to wildlife habitat in areas that are developing or, in relationship to development. So there's examples that you can link to of HOAs that have kind of habitat management written into their, I don't even know, like the charter and the management, documents that y'all have. And you can fund habitat management through the HOA fees, and it's not necessarily overwhelming. If the HOA wants to do it, y'all can collect fees and fund it. So that I could recommend just looking up the Green Growth Toolbox and looking through there.
Thank you, Casey. I wonder if some of our other organizations have any written resources that they want to talk about. No, I'm not hearing anybody. Okay, I think pretty much every organization that participated here has a website with printable resources. I know the Wildlife Resources Commission has a lot, but depending on what specialty you're talking about, whether it's forest management or wildlife management or water quality, all of these entities try their best to create these resources. So sometimes it's a matter of just hunting down a handout or a brochure about the specific thing that you're looking for. So the answer is a whole bunch. Okay, let's see. And as we go through here, I'll try to find stuff and post some links in the chat. And anybody else who knows of anything, please feel free to do the same. Let's see. If you're looking to purchase forest land, how many acres are recommended to prevent fragmentation? Well, that's an interesting one. Anyone?
I don't mind taking a little bit of that, especially since Rachel's not here today. But I think, so fragmentation, I think, first of all, it depends on location, about what's around you. So I'm not sure that there's really any specific given size number of acres to prevent fragmentation, but it's essentially where you're located and kind of what your neighbors do too. So when you have a land area, when you have neighbors who are doing similar management on contiguous acres, that makes a huge difference as opposed to being in an urban or suburban area where you may not know where the next development's going to go and things like that. But I would say in general, to prevent fragmentation, the further you go away from some of the urban areas to the more slowly land fragments from there. So yeah, I guess that's and I will say too, I've done a couple presentations on fragmentation before, and we always talk about it as if it's kind of has a negative connotation. Fragmentation can also be beneficial in some ways. So you can have fragmentation from rivers or structures, or you could have fragmentation from a hill or a mountain that prevents an invasive species from moving to other property or so. So I just want to remind everyone, it's fragmentation's for the most part bad because we think about it in terms of development and urban sprawl, but there are some examples that are good as well.
Thank you, Liz. It's 2:33 right now, and I just want to make sure everybody who's still with us knows that we're going to stick around until 3. So if you have questions or you're enjoying the discussion, we're not going to, officially end this until 3 o'clock. So by all means, stay on. Let's see, another question that we have here. I recently purchased my property. This is from Krista, and have a few big stands of bamboo and other invasive species, what's the best resources for removing them? Anyone want to take that on? Bamboo is tough, especially we do have a native bamboo. It's a Arundinaria gigantea, which is wonderful and doesn't get nearly as tall as like your Asiatic bamboos, but it's pretty hard to get rid of bamboo. I think that's one of those situations where herbicides might be necessary.
And I think this is another one that depends on the size. So if you've got an amount of bamboo that you can realistically dig out and remove versus a larger stand. So it really would depend on the size, but I think there are also probably online, there may be a lot of resources about different areas and different types of bamboo and how to remove it.
Is bamboo a root similar to like aspen trees? Does it propagate through root growth?
It's technically a grass.
Oh,
So
it's like
think
aspen.
of really, really, really big turf grass.
Yeah.
That's basically what bamboo is.
Well, aspen trees in Colorado are grass. Similar. So interesting. Okay, thanks.
I'll add a little bit to the idea of managing for invasive species. So just, it's likely you'll need to be prepared to keep at it again and again and again. And if you can hit it from multiple angles, say, digging it up, maybe even cutting it back at times and then applying herbicide, and that's bamboo, or, Aleagnus is a big invasive in our area. Microstegium is a tough one. That's another grass that its seeds will stay viable in the soil for up to 7 years. And so you'll just have to keep at it. And then there's pre-emergence you can put in the soil as well. So I think that would be key is staying after it year after year, season after season, and hitting it with multiple, from multiple angles.
Thank you for bringing that up. That yeah, it does take being persistent, and usually it's not a 1-year effort. It's maybe the first year might be the biggest, hardest effort, but every year after that, hopefully it gets easier, but you'll have to keep at it. By the way, there's a ton of amazing links that all sorts of people are sharing about the resources that we've talked about in the presentations and in our discussions. So keep looking through. If there's a resource that you want to find a web link for, it might very well be in there already. Okay, so let's see. We have box turtles in our wooded backyard. How can I protect their habitat from erosion? I'm trying wheatgrass this year. Any other suggestions? That's from Jesse.
Yeah, so I'll jump in. I think just in general, vegetation that is providing good ground cover is really the key for erosion control. So for the most part, it doesn't really matter what it is, as long as it's got good ground cover and preferably, native, non-invasive, all that kind of stuff. If you can have trees, that's great because they're going to provide that canopy cover as well. That's going to slow the raindrops from the impact on the soil. But it doesn't necessarily need to be a forested area either. So just good, solid vegetation cover.
Anything to avoid bare soil, right? Little patches of bare soil can be great. They can actually provide habitat for native bees, but you don't want big areas of bare soil. Those native plants, native wildflowers are a great way to just stabilize that soil so it doesn't sort of wash into the waterways when you get those big rain events. There's another question for Maria. It says, I've got a very weak creek that stems from a spring. Is there any benefit to trying to make it stronger by digging it out a bit? Is that even a good idea?
So no, it would actually be illegal to do that. So although I admire the wanting to improve, generally natural is better. So leave it with natural, and actually essentially that would be considered an impact. And within forestry or timber harvesting, we have exemptions from a lot of the permitting requirements for impacts. Like for instance, crossing a stream with a temporary crossing would be something that if you were doing a development, you'd be required to get a permit just to do that, even temporarily. Forestry has exemptions, but it's very specific that it's within the confines of forestry specific activities. So if you're not doing something that's specifically timber harvest and you're going to be impacting a wetland, a stream, a pond, anything like that, you have to get permits to be able to do that first. But in general, natural is best. So I'd say it's totally fine how it is. If it's a small stream, that's absolutely fine. It still provides habitat and it's still beneficial. So
That's a positive answer because that means less work, right? Sometimes less work makes more impact. So let's see, we've got, and by the way, there's a link in here that somebody put up about bamboo management, bamboo removal. So that was, thank you, Julian, for posting a couple of links related to that. Let's see, can family farms gain access to carbon banking?
I'll take that one on. So I believe absolutely. If you have forest land, especially that can be sequestering the carbon, then there's our options out there. There might be minimum acreage requirements depending on the company, but there's two companies I know specifically. One is NCX, and they do agreements on a 1-year basis. So you would just be tying up your property for a single year and committing to not harvesting timber for that year. Then it's renewable the next year. And that's a nice short-term commitment. And of course, if for some reason you did have to harvest timber within that time period, there's no consequence, but you just don't get the income from the carbon storage. There's another company called Finite Carbon. There's several others out there, I'm sure, but a lot of them do more long-term agreements with you. And really, as I understand it, if your timberlands are of harvestable age in a commercial sense, then you can sign up to get carbon credits for not harvesting those areas. So especially those of you who have no interest in harvesting your timber, that's a significant income source that I encourage you to look into. Yes. I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, thank you, Liz. And Leslie McCormick with the NC Tree Farm program just posted that there's going to be a webinar on carbon markets on July 14th. Registration is not open yet, but it will be soon. So stay tuned there. Again, that's the NC Tree Farm program that's going to be hosting that. We've got a question from Maria. I have a creek in my backyard and noticed that it is chronically muddy. What would cause this?
So there's 3 different types of water erosion. There's sheet erosion, rill erosion, and gully erosion. So rill and gully erosion, you're going to be able to see with your eye pretty easily if there's, rills or gullies forming. You might be able to identify the location where that is. Sheet erosion is a little bit more difficult to see because it's going across more of a wide scale landscape, but you'd have to have a relatively large bare area if you're going to see muddy water in your creek because of that. It also could be something upstream. So it might not be coming from your property, it could be coming from somewhere else upstream, and then it would be very difficult for you to identify what's causing it. So if it's something that you don't think is related to your land, you don't see any erosion happening, it could be somewhere further up. Yeah.
Wow, I had no idea that there were different categories of it makes sense. I just never thought about it before. Thank you, Maria. We've got a question from Krista. Are toxic algae blooms something that we see here? Yes, we have toxic algae blooms. I think that's kind of out of my wheelhouse as a terrestrial wildlife biologist, but I think that's more likely to happen in bigger bodies of water. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it's more likely to happen on the shore or like in some of our large lakes. And they can definitely be associated with too many nutrients in the soil that have washed into those bodies of water through lots of fertilizer from agriculture or private or even like suburban and urban areas from, lots of dog waste can contribute to that sort of nutrients in the soil that can feed bacteria and algae. I'm going to stop talking now since I'm. Let's see. I think we've talked about most of the questions that I've seen. Lots of cool comments. Bob shared a link about NC State Cooperative Extension has a fact sheet on carbon markets. If you're interested in that and you haven't seen that yet, definitely look at that link that he shared. If I missed any questions from anyone, if you have a burning question, feel free to raise your hand in the chat. Jennifer's got a great comment. A connected side note, I assume, to talk about invasive species management in particular. Liz Snyder and others are going to be leading a women's chainsaw safety course on August 18th at Pilot Mountain State Park. I'm reading this, but Liz could probably chime in and talk about it directly.
Yeah, it's a very popular class where we go through the general operation of a chainsaw and some tree felling techniques. And we usually get outside and play around a little with the chainsaws.
Love it. That direct hands-on experience is invaluable. We can talk concepts all day via these recorded presentations, these digital presentations, but getting out there and actually having somebody show you how to do the work is just very, very valuable. We've got a question from Martha. What organization could help or offer advice with man-made pond wildlife and water quality?
I'm not as good on the organization front. I mean, there's Division of Water Resources, but I don't think they're really going to be doing as much of that type of stuff. They more oversee regulatory. So although I'm water quality, I might not be the best person to answer this one. I'll pass it on if anyone else has got anything.
I think too, so when you have a pond on your property and everything, there are a lot of private companies too that will offer a lot of advice, and we'll take a look. I know there's one in the Triangle that does a lot of different types of pond management. So I think from state and federal organizations, you can probably find some guidelines and a little bit of that technical help. But as far as implementation, you may want to visit websites of some of the private companies.
I'd always probably steer more towards companies that talk about planting natives, anything that might involve introducing new plants into a pond or into some sort of landscaping. If they're talking about native plants to North Carolina, it's probably going to be a good bet that they're going to be very aware of conservation practices, more so than businesses that are just kind of trying to provide something that looks good but doesn't necessarily provide healthy water and healthy habitat. I wish I could name a business for you, but I don't know any off the top of my head. I got a bunch of questions about the chainsaw class. How can you be notified of the registration for the chainsaw class? So Liz, if you have anything to share about how to find out about this class and probably future classes, looks like there's plenty of people interested.
Yeah, if I'm sure Jennifer's still following, maybe she'll have a link or tell us when that link will be available. It's just, we just decided upon this within the last month. So it's kind of developing and getting the flyers developed and all that. So we'll see if Jennifer can pop in here and let us know more.
I see she did say, oh, go ahead, Jennifer.
No problem. It should be coming out any day now. We're just finishing up the registration link. So at a minimum, anybody has access to post things on that Facebook group, including all of yourselves, if you have even anything in your own backyard you want to share or anything like that. So at a minimum, I'll probably post it on there. And then we always post it on our extension website also, and whatever other partners are involved in those usually share it out as well. So I'm sure you'll be getting more information about that. And I know of at least one other one in that the county extension agents are also putting one August, I believe it's the 13th or 14th in Waynesboro, North Carolina, which is in the western part of the state. And then I believe there's they're planning on doing more. They're putting in a grant to do a couple more of those in the coming year if you can't make it to either of those in August. And somebody also asked about bringing your own saw, so I can just elaborate. If you don't have a saw, if you're interested in learning more about what saws are even available, or the different sizes or the different brands, our instructors usually bring all of the chainsaws they own, which is a lot of them. And so you have the option to kind of practice with lots of different kinds. And so you can, borrow one of theirs for the day, and then might help you figure out what kind you want to get if you decide to get one afterwards.
I want to go to this thing.
Yeah.
I'll leave room for the other people though. I already have a chainsaw. I don't need it. Sorry I just realized I was still sharing my screen, and now everybody can see each other if they choose to have their camera on. So see. April suggests that the local NC State County Extension Office can have information about pond management. So, okay, let's see. We've got a comment or a question from Joan. I have 67 acres cut and planted 22 years ago in pines under forestry management. I was thinking it was time to thin. I've had 3 companies come to walk the property. They're so inundated with people cutting full growth tracks that they say it'll be more than 3 years before they can cut. Should I just wait?
It sounds like you are at a good age to cut. And seeing that 3 of them came to visit, it sounds like it is marketable. I'm not surprised that, there's been a lot of harvesting going on with market demand. So I'm not surprised that it will be a wait. I think, if you can, get it out there sooner than later, depending. But of course, if you can hire a consulting forester, they would provide you the best information, the best advice there for your area, and they can help you market that timber and likely get it going sooner than later.
Thanks. I think I've gone through all the questions, but we still got a few minutes. We can just enjoy our time together.
I'll throw out one other note about the pond thing. So just as a FYI to be aware of, an issue I have seen before is where you are going to place your pond. So I actually had a wetland restoration that I worked on because somebody wanted to put in a pond for their horses, but they put it in where there was previously a wetland and ended up getting an NOV from the state and from the Corps. So just if you're going to put in a pond, be very cognizant of the location that you're putting it in, because that would be considered an impact, which again would need to be permitted ahead of time. So just if you're going to put in a pond, either do it in upland or make sure that you're following the proper channels. So location matters on that stuff.
I guess the consequences of putting in a pond where livestock are going to be drinking in a like an area that's connected to the local waterway is whatever feces or other nutrients that they're introducing into that pond water is going to be going into the greater watershed. So that's definitely an impact that can reduce water quality. So definitely a good thing to mention. Oh, Luis is asking, I've got beavers that are causing flooding in the forest land. There's already a lot of wetland and swampland on the track. Should we be getting rid of the beavers? So, like I said before, it really depends on whether or not the beavers are causing problems for you. Because when the beavers are creating wetlands, then those wetlands provide, amazing habitat and amazing water cleaning services for the greater area. But if you're managing that property for, say, timber production, and beaver dams are flooding the area so that trees can't grow, then you kind of have to make that decision on, how do you want to manage this land? Are you okay with it being wetland, or do you really need it to be drier? In which case you might consider removing the beavers. It really is a decision that the property owner has to make on what their goals are. I would always argue that, if you've got beavers in your area that are creating wetlands and they're not causing direct harm to you or your bottom line, then leave them. But if you're trying to grow timber, or again, they're causing, flooding damage to property or roads, then by all means. We even have a statewide beaver management assistance program where professional beaver trackers can come and remove the beavers on your property for you. And that's called BMAP. Deanna shared the link for BMAP. So again, it really depends on what you want and how you feel about the beavers. By the way, in case you're interested, on that Beaver Management Assistance Program website is a little video that I made that has a big explosion in it, which is really super cool. So you might want to visit the site just to watch the really short video. It's like 3 minutes long and talks about the program. No beavers were harmed in the making of that video, by the way. It was an explosion to explode the beaver dam, not the beavers themselves. All right, we've got 4 more minutes. Any other comments or questions from anybody? Bye, Debbie. I guess that was a goodbye wave. Got a comment from Kimberly, one of our conservation biologists with the Wildlife Commission, saying that our website has a way to find licensed trappers. That's true. So we do have a little tool where you can search based on what county you're in for a list of licensed trappers if you're having issues with beavers or issues with other types of wildlife. And you can basically make contact with those trappers during trapping season, and they'd be happy to come and trap those animals for you. There's also wildlife control agents, which are professionals that have been trained and licensed through the Wildlife Commission to do professional wildlife removals, usually in a more urban setting. So say if you've got squirrels getting into your attic and you need a professional to come and help you get the squirrels out of your attic, wildlife control agents can do that kind of work for you. It's like hiring a pest control company. So they do charge a fee for their service, but they're very good at what they do. And you can find contacts for those people on our website as well. That's the Wildlife Resources Commission's website. And Kimberly shared a link for that. Last chance for questions. I guess before we go, I can say that I do want to give a very heartfelt thanks for everybody who was here to present today. Part of the strength of Forest Her NC is the collaboration of many different organizations from across the state, in some cases, national organizations, state organizations, nonprofits, local organizations. We're all working together to get the word out about how to, how people can manage their land for the betterment of people and wildlife and, healthy water and all that kind of good stuff. So thank you for being a part of this effort to connect this amazing information to the landowners who can use it. And thanks to all the participants who are here and spent their time today learning all this information.